And so you've done a fair bit of travel, I think it's fair to say. So you've been to the UAE, you've been to the UK recently. I saw that. What
Yep.
was the purpose of that?
Yeah, so UK, that was a family holiday. So
Oh
I
yeah,
dragged
fair enough.
my family along to some nuclear plants. So we, first one went to was Sizewell. Sizewell, people might be familiar with it. I'm sure if there's a photo of it, people would probably recognize it. It's this like big blue structure with this white dome. They think it looks nice. I think it looks a bit scary. Um, but, but that was really interesting. That was where I actually hugged the nuclear waste. I also got to see, because basically at Sizewell, they've got basically 3 nuclear power plants. They've got Sizewell A, which is being decommissioned. They've got Sizewell B, which is, I think it was built in the 80s or 90s or something. And then they've got Sizewell C. And Sizewell C will be the UK's newest nuclear project. And when I went, it's really just dirt and stuff. But they were doing some really excellent work there. But the interesting thing about that trip was then I went to the other side of the UK, to Hinkley C. Now, people are probably familiar with Hinkley C because they've had huge cost blowouts and stuff. And there are a few reasons for that. It's widely considered that it could be the most expensive nuclear power plant project which is ever constructed. Now, it's a huge construction site. I think it's something like 13,000 people work there. And it's funny because an Australian is the project director at that site.
Oh really?
Yeah,
That's
and I
ironic.
got to interview him, which was really funny, actually, and he's really excellent. And it's funny because, an Australian is the project director there, running the construction. And I got to interview him, and I think the thing I took away from that, when you've got 13,000 workers at a site or whatever, is, in Australia, the unions are against nuclear energy, and I'm like, there couldn't be a better thing for the union movement than nuclear power. And that's probably one of the biggest messages I got out of that trip to the UK was, you talk to workers there, and a lot of them are, in union jobs. They're very high paid jobs, which have really helped these communities where these power plants are being constructed. But you look at a place like the UK, I'm pretty sure that project I was talking about, Hinkley C, will provide around about 7% of the UK's electricity. And that other project on the other side of the country is basically going to be a replica of what's happening at Hinkley C, and they're just calling it Sizewell C.
Oh wow.
And
Okay. Yep.
I think the other highlight of that trip for me was an interesting thing, and it's called, and it's basically learnings. And when people talk about learnings in nuclear, it basically means that, obviously the first time where you build a nuclear reactor from scratch, it's going to be expensive because you'll learn all of these things, you'll work out all these issues that you'll have, and you'll have to resolve all of these issues, you'll have to train up all these workforces, you'll have to put all of this work in place. But what they've actually found, and they've found this around the world, is say a site like Hinkley C, yes, the first reactor was very expensive, but the second unit will be 20 to 30% cheaper. And then the idea of then having the similar one at Sizewell is that if you're getting those kind of efficiencies between those projects, well, you'd hope there'd then be further efficiencies there. And you can have sort of a fleet effect where, yes, the first one might be really expensive, but the ones after that can reduce in cost. And I guess you'll probably ask me at some point about the cost of nuclear, but you'll hear a lot of these projects, whether it's Hinkley C in the UK or Vogel in the US, and yes, they're very, very expensive, but that's the first time, Hinkley C is the first time that the UK has built a nuclear power plant in around 30 years. Vogel, very, very similar. First time that the US has built nuclear reactors in 30 years or whatever. And they're finding all these costs, but in both cases, between when they then built the next unit, they've had significant cost reductions. And it's the exact same thing when you look at renewables. Like obviously, like the first solar panel would probably have costed a bomb, but now all the way down, they're getting significantly cheaper because they can learn things, they've innovations, And that's the exact same thing in nuclear. So that was probably the second highlight of that trip for me. But again, it was a family holiday. I dragged my family along. It was not funded by Nuclear for Australia, contrary to what people actually said.
Well, I mean,
but
make the most of travel whenever you do it.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
And you've also been to the US, so I imagine you visited some sites there as well.
Yeah.
What were some of the quick highlights of that?
Yeah, so I visited 2 nuclear power plants in the US. The first one was the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant on the coast of California. That provides around 9% of California's power. And that was fascinating because I think because it's on the ring of fire. So people talk about earthquake risk with nuclear, and you've literally got this nuclear plant which has been safely licensed by the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission to operate there. And it could potentially be operating for another few decades. So that was really interesting. I got to do a bit of a tour around there. I also went fishing for three-eyed fish because our politicians have been telling us that three-eyed fish frequent the waters around nuclear power plants. I did catch lots of fish. They all had 2 eyes though, was the issue. But that was, look, if anyone is ever going to visit a nuclear power plant, visit Diablo because the wildlife around there is incredible. They've got this thing called Lion Rock, and it's where you've got hundreds of sea lions, like literally right outside a nuclear power plant. There's lovely nature walks. That was fascinating. And anyway, the second trip was to the Vogtle nuclear power station, the one I just mentioned. And those were the newest reactors built in the US, probably the newest reactors in the world, AP1000s from Westinghouse. And that was just fascinating. I think it really put into perspective how different modern nuclear power plants are to older ones such as Diablo, such as Sizewell B. They've really progressed a really long way. And they look modern, they are modern, they've got all of these new brilliant safety systems in them, which literally can shut down the reactor without human intervention.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I thought that was really fascinating because, these modern reactors we're talking about, there hasn't been a nuclear accident as a result of reactors built in, the last 40 years. So, of course, during that time, there's a huge difference between the iPhone 1 and the iPhone 16, or whatever it is, up to now, or like a plane which the Wright brothers built as compared to an A380.
Yeah.
And that's sort of how I think people should think about it with nuclear is that, yes, there was Chernobyl, but those reactors were built decades ago and would in no way meet the safety standards which are now applied to these modern reactors, some of which are designed to shut down without human intervention. There's even been a reactor recently opened in China, which has been built basically meltdown proof, where it just physically cannot melt down.
How do they do that?
I don't know. They're smarter than I am. But there are all kinds of technologies, a lot of which are, meltdown proof and stuff. And obviously that's been very hard to keep track of, but it's just really important to, you can hate, obviously I probably protest with people against if people were saying to build some of those Russian reactors in Australia. If the coalition was proposing for those reactors to be built, which were built in the Ukraine where Chernobyl occurred, I'd probably be marching on the street protesting that.
We can get into the politics. We can get into the politics in a bit, but in the US, is it Microsoft and is it their AI or like Open AI, or is it one of them is building or like reviving 3 Mile Island?
Yeah.
Did you get a chance to visit there as well, or didn't get a chance?
No, I'd love to.
Yeah.
But that's an interesting thing with nuclear power. So sort of to take us back to the beginning, nuclear creates abundant, reliable power. So you compare it to, say, renewables, which are generating, they've got capacity factors of around 20 to 30%, and that's because the sun doesn't shine forever and the wind doesn't blow forever. And storage technologies like batteries are really expensive, and then pumped hydro is, also very expensive and takes a long time to build. And then hydrogen, green hydrogen, sort of not really proven around the world. So this has become a real issue when you think of, AI and data centers, which require always on, which require abundant, reliable energy to power those data centers. We're looking at data centers requiring a huge percentage of global electricity around the world. I'm probably getting it wrong, but I think there's been some estimates that by 2030, like 10% or something of Australia's power could be used by data centers.
Wow.
So
That's a lot.
in other countries, and don't get me wrong, there are leaders of data center companies in Australia which are arguing for nuclear power. Craig Scroggie is one that comes to mind. But in the US, all these data center companies, such as Microsoft, such as Amazon, such as Oracle, Meta, are all suddenly investing in nuclear power. And one example of that is, like you said, Microsoft recently signed a deal with Constellation to reopen 3 Mile Island Unit 2 to generate electricity for their data centers. Funny thing about 3 Mile Island as well is that, yes, one of those reactors there had the meltdown, but the other reactor there was still operating until 2019.
Really?
It was only recently closed.
I thought they would have been closed for decades, but
yeah,
I guess
you would have thought, well, if you listen to the Netflix show, you would have thought that it's like a toxic, toxic place for like decades. But people were working there, and now they're going to reopen that second unit. But there's been other announcements made. I can't think of specifics off the top of my head, but certainly like Amazon Web Services have got deals. There's all of these companies, and to be honest, expect a lot more of it. There's a huge nuclear renaissance going on around the world, and a big part driving that is AI and data centers. And to be honest, I think that that's just one of the many reasons why Australia needs to consider nuclear power, is because, whether it's data centers, whether it's electrifying everything from electric cars to electric cookers, all these kind of things, our energy demand is going to skyrocket. Potentially, I think AEMO predicts that it could basically double by 2050. Now, if that happens, if our electricity demand is doubling, how are we going to get there? And yes, we might be going okay getting a certain share of renewables in our current grid with our current demand, but if we're only going okay and we're even struggling to meet some of those targets, how are we possibly going to get to that demand? So when people say, oh, well, we don't need nuclear, it's like, well, I'm sorry, we need to have all energy options on the table. We need to be investing in every single source of clean energy, because if we're going to be able to do this, let alone keep the lights on, we need to have all of those options in place.
So, appreciate that.